This is Ralph Sass. This is the lecture for Accounting 212, Chapter 7 on activity-based costing. Activity-based costing is designed to provide with better cost information. And it's a complex, it's relatively easy to do here in class. In the real world, it is very complex. But the reason why we might want to do this is because we might want to find out, we might want to determine, if you will, how profitable is a customer. Okay, and you see this all the time if you go to the bank or what have you, where they may have various charges, or they say, you know, if you get automatic deposits, there'll be no charge for the checking account, what have you. The reason all those decisions have been made is to try to determine how profitable the customer is. Another way to think, another example where this has been used recently is in things like hospitals. How much does it cost for a particular surgery or particular rehab or what have you, when you have all these different services coming in, and it's very difficult using what we've studied so far, whether it's process costing or really job costing, to figure out what it actually costs to provide various services. Okay, now what typically happened, and what we studied back in chapters 3 and 4, was that manufacturing costs were included in that traditional product cost. However, what we didn't do is we didn't worry about these non-manufacturing costs. Those were not done. Okay, so under ABC costing, not only are we going to include manufacturing costs, but we're also going to include non-manufacturing costs. And the reason why we're going to do this is because things like how profitable is a customer, how profitable is a particular product. Maybe for one particular product, there's no engineering that's required. For another product, there's a lot of engineering that's required. How do we differentiate between the pricing and the costs for those two different products? Even something as simple as cleanup. Suppose one product requires a lot of cleanup, and one product that you manufacture requires very little or almost no cleanup. They're then using different amounts of overhead in that particular product. So, first thing, ABC activity-based costing is going to include both non-manufacturing as well as manufacturing costs. I should also point out at this point, this is relatively new. This has only been around since about the 80s. So it's relatively new. Okay, so you can see here that activity-based costing is include most, but perhaps not all. We'll find out why here in a minute. To the costs, it's also going to include some non-manufacturing costs. Okay. And what it's also going to do is it's going to use a lot of different cost pools. If you go back and take a look at what we did back in chapters 3 or chapters 4, okay, we had overhead rates that were either here where we had one rate dependent, and it was determined perhaps based upon manufacturing hours or labor hours or a labor rate. And then when we got to chapter 4, we may have had different overhead rates for a different department as the item was going down the assembly line. So we may have had even 2 or 3 different rates in the company. Now we're going to have a lot. Okay, we're going to have a lot of different, perhaps, activity rates, and that's going to need to be incorporated into our costing system. Okay, a little bit of a delay here, don't know why. So, each activity-based costing pool is going to have its own unique measure of activity, okay? And I've already mentioned that the traditional ones required things like labor hours or machine hours, what have you. And in this particular case, we're going to use a lot more overhead rates. Okay. Now, what we're going to look for are various activities. Now, for purposes of this class, I'm going to have to provide you all these. In the real world, you would have to determine them. Okay. And then each of those activities is going to create an activity cost pool, which is a bucket that's going to collect those particular costs. And then what we're going to need to do is come up with some activity measure, which is going to be the base that we're going to use in this particular case. A lot of times the term you'll see used is a cost driver. Okay. Another example of where this was used, and I was talking to a buddy of mine once, and I asked him what he was doing, and he was watching them process claims. He worked for an insurance company, and he was watching them process claims with a stopwatch. And you go, watching them process claims with a stopwatch, what are you doing? And the whole purpose of that was to try to determine how long it took to process a claim and how much it cost to process, in this case, a life insurance claim. Now, there are two different types of drivers. Okay, one is a transaction driver for the number of transactions or the number of things that occur, and then another one is a duration for how much time is needed. Typically, okay, when we look back at chapters 3 and 4, those were what we would call, in this case, traditional cost systems. And in those particular cases, we were relying on volume, okay, measures such as direct labor hours or machine hours. Here, activity-based costing is going to have 5 levels, okay, that don't necessarily relate to the volume of units. What those 5 levels are, and they all make sense if you think about it, are kind of summarized here on this slide. And the way to think about it, and let's start at the very bottom of the scale, if you will, and that's a unit, okay? And at the unit level is what are the costs in making that particular unit, okay? And so that's kind of the very basic one. That may very well be based upon machine hours or something like that. Then as we move up, what are the costs with a batch? Okay, perhaps when I have that batch, I need separate engineering. Perhaps I need cleanup to come in. You know, I may not clean up the machinery after every unit is produced, but I may come in and clean up the machinery after every batch. So these activities are going to be different than unit level activities. And then finally, from a production level, I'm going to get up to product level activities, things such as engineering, quality control. These are levels that are on the product that I may not necessarily be doing on the unit or batch level. Those 3 I would look at from a manufacturing standpoint, although they could be from other departments, what have you, but usually those are going to be from the manufacturing standpoint. Customer level activities, how much does it cost to have the accounting people fielding calls from the customer, or customer service people fielding calls from customer service or inquiries from email, what have you, to take care of that customer. And then finally we get up to organization sustaining activities. What are those activities that are required to keep the organization going that we can't tie down to any particular customer, product, what have you? Things like the president's salary would fall under organizational sustaining. So if you think about it, there's 5 layers here, there's 5 levels, starting at unit and then going all the way up to organizational sustaining activities. This, I do not want to underemphasize in any way, shape, or form. This is extremely difficult to implement, okay? And if you're going to implement it, you're going to need strong support from your management staff. You're going to need a lot of people from around the organization involved, because this is not easy. This is going to be a totally separate accounting system that you're going to need to create, maintain, and it is not going to be easy. So let's take a look at an example here. In this particular case, this company makes batteries. They have sales of 50 million. They have some direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing, overhead, all those things we saw back in chapters 3 and 4. Gives them a gross margin of 9 million. Then they have selling, general, and administrative expenses, and in this case they're losing $2 million. Okay? So, a couple of quick notes about this just before I go on. Things like shipping expense, if you think about it, those are customer specific. So I may have customers that because of their shipping, because of the shipping expense, maybe because of how many orders they place, maybe because of how far away they are, I lose money on them. So that's where an activity-based costing system could be beneficial. So even though they're buying a product that's profitable, what have you, because of the shipping or how they order, I may in fact be losing money on them. So now notice what they've created. They've created, in this case, 5 activity pools. They've got one, let's start at the top, customer orders, which is the number of customer orders. How often do you place an order? Because keep in mind, each order has to be processed. I probably don't want you placing an order every day. Maybe once a week, maybe every other week would even be better. So I want to know how many customer orders I have, because every time an order comes, I have to process it. How many design changes are there? Okay. How big is your order? I.e., how many machine hours? Okay. How many of active customers do we have as far as customer relations? And then finally they have other. So those are the activity pools they defined for their company. Every company would need to define their own. And here's their list of what goes in those. They have customer orders, design changes. You can see there all costs of resources consumed by a customer who requested design change. Order size, assigned all costs of resources consumed as a consequence of the number of units produced. Customer relations, and then they used other for organizational sustaining activities. So, first thing they came up with is they broke up the production department in direct factory wages. They broke up all the manufacturing and non-manufacturing costs. Now, a thing to notice here first off is that notice that direct material and direct labor is not on here. Direct material and activity-based costing is a way to allocate all the other expenses, overhead, what have you. We do not need to allocate direct materials. We know exactly where they're going because they're direct materials. We do not need to allocate direct labor. We know exactly where those costs are going. So activity-based costing is simply to allocate all those other overhead and non-manufacturing costs. Okay. Notice also here, they included shipping. I didn't catch that on my last slide. Shipping are excluded because their existing cost system can directly trace those costs to products or consumers. Okay, or customer orders. So notice they did direct materials, direct labor, and then shipping because their current accounting system already does that. So what we're looking for here in this chapter is how do we allocate overhead. Now, this is where my buddy with a stopwatch came into play. This is where you'd have to do some analysis to figure out exactly what you're looking at. But notice what they've done. They've taken the production department and they've taken indirect factory wages and they put 30% on that on customer orders, 30% on design changes, 20% on order size, 10% on customer relations, 10% on other, for a total of 100%. Notice the totals always have to be 100%. You have to allocate all the costs. Okay, where are you going to get this information? By your knowledge of the organization, by perhaps a stopwatch, what have you. Notice, in some cases there's zeros, and that's okay. Not every category needs a particular item. Okay, some items will have up to 100%. That's okay. Total is always 100%. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our overhead. Okay, in this case, let's just start with our production up here, 6 million. We're going to multiply it by 30%. Where'd that 30% come from? That 30% came from the prior slide with the percentages. So how much do I apply to customer orders? I apply 1,000,008 to customer orders. And I do this for that entire spreadsheet. Okay, notice the next one, factory equipment depreciations, 3,000,005. That percentage was 20%, so I put 700,000 in that customer orders. And notice, then I go ahead and complete the entire item. Now a couple of things to note here. First off, some of those things that had zeros have no costs assigned. That's perfectly okay. When it had 100%, there's the 2 million and there's the 2 million. That's perfectly okay. Notice the 1,000,008 plus the 1,000,008 plus the 1,000,002 plus 600 and 600 is going to give us that total of 6 million. So how did they get that total there? It added all those numbers up. And how did they get these individual numbers here? They're multiplying them by that percentage. And then notice also they've got totals at the bottom. These totals at the bottom are going to be very important. Okay, those totals at the bottom are going to be very important. I am going to stop here and pick it up here with the second video for this chapter. Thank you.